So let's begin. So on the cover of the catalogue of the 1979 Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Transformations in Modern Architecture, the towers of John Portman's Renaissance Center in Detroit rise from the mist surrounding early morning commuter trains, as if beckoning the city's workforce towards a gleaming new future. The image crystallizes the fate of Detroit as capital of the 20th century. The progress of the modern industrial economy running on rails here meets its end. There is no mediation. The trains disappear as if right into the core of Renaissance Center, swallowed whole by a building over which the light of a new day gently breaks. And the interior certainly swallowed things whole. Inside the MoMA catalogue, Renaissance Center's vast atrium is revealed in another spectacular photograph by Yukio Futagawa. The cylindrical central tower defines the circularity of all elements in the atrium. From circular walkways descend spiral stairs to pod-like seating bays. Within this curvilinear world, a veritable garden of earthly delights flourishes, an Eden outside of which it would seem nothing else need exist. This is a garden city, its circularity making real the ideal diagram of Ebenezer Howard's utopian projections. The concrete columns supporting the structure appear like towers themselves, arising out of the canopy of green to form a skyline all of their own. The atrium of Detroit's Renaissance Center is Atlanta interiorized. The lush canopy and skyline of the Sunbelt city is transposed in miniature but fully formed to the downtown of the Rust Belt. The commission for Renaissance Center came from Henry Ford Jr., thanks to the commercial success of Portman's Peachtree Center in Atlanta, a multi-block mixed-use development where in 1967, the same year as the race riots which spurred Ford's commission in Detroit, Portman completed the Hyatt Regency Hotel that we see here, its 22-story atrium redefining the architectural, developmental, and experiential possibilities of downtown, and in the process becoming his architectural signature. By the mid-1970s, Portman atriums were on the drawing board or in construction as part of urban developments in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Fort Worth, New York, Brussels, and Cairo. Portman's 1976 book, The Architect as Developer, gave its title to what was making him so successful in that period, the operational structure that would link architecture and property development. And as it emerged via Portman and soon proliferated through work of countless architects in firms in cities across the globe, the atrium became the characteristic architectural space of this period. Yet the time between its emergence in the Hyatt Regency and its apotheosis in the 48-story void of Portman's Atlanta Marriott Marquis of 1985 frames what is currently understood as an extended period of crisis in the American city, and especially in its downtown. At this time, crisis came to be understood as a turning point, the city held in the balance between death and life, a sense presaged by the title of Jane Jacobs' classic 1961 chronicle of New York City urbanity. In this period, it was not clear according to whose terms the city's death or life might be established. If the life inherent in squares, streets, and small urban places could be shown to be the essence of urbanity, the infrastructural violence of highway systems and other architectural grand projets might be banished. Yet if the growth of cities could not effectively be planned at the regional scale, was not the idea of the city dead anyway? Was the only viable architectural option a retreat into the boudoir, or was it a task of communicating in tune with a roadside vernacular? Was there architectural knowledge to be generated in mythologizing a hyper-capitalist urban delirium, or in a more historically fundamental, read European, refiguring of the ground of architectural experience? And if these questions point to the key investigations and polemics of the period across architecture and urban studies, what lay everywhere around them was social and racial inequality and violence. The atrium, as Portman imagined it and brought it to life, might seem peripheral to these by now very well-known positions and debates. Its period of flourishing perhaps only symptomatic of the massive expansion of a commercial imperative in architecture, highly visible by the middle of the 1970s, the time federal urban renewal programs effectively ceased. Yet, to dismiss this architecture as a kind of epiphenomenon of other larger scale forces is to miss precisely what it brought to the American downtown and to architecture at this time. The atrium and its attendant spaces such as pedestrian links and concourses above and below the street emerged as a distinct way of conceiving of and constructing the city. The atrium enveloped, encompassing the city's exteriority within architecture's spatial and organisational repertoire. And this repertoire itself transforming along with the emergence of the atrium, combined with an ordered and strategic process of intervening in and thus remaking the city. Emerging in this combination, interior urbanism galvanised action as well as critical debate, and arrayed architects, city planners, politicians, financiers, theorists and critics around downtown as the urban problem of the period. Now, apropos Portman, it's worth emphasising that these debates were literally arranged around a void. We will not find much evidence there for the particularly interior nature of what underpinned this work. Or at least, looking at the way this work was represented in the professional journal of professional magazine Interior, the cover of which we see here, provides a different way or a different opening onto the urban and architectural conditions of the time. Looking across interiors in the 1960s and 70s, designs which cross scales and practices became a distinct feature. In this period, interiors devoted more page space to Portman's designs than any architectural magazine. Yet it was not just the designs which were seen as significant. The scope of Portman's architectural and business interests enabled interiors to project the profession's urban role, and Atlanta played a major part in this. As the editor of the magazine, Olga Gueft, claims, the city, quote, offers a unique case study in instant environmental planning by teams of developers and architects. Olga Gueft was one of the first reviewers of Peachtree Center, reading it in terms of its interior interconnection and the nested scales of enclosure, from large-scale atrium to the intimacy of a booth in a bar or restaurant. She was prescient in her analysis. The Hyatt Regency Atlanta had opened across from a building whose business continues to anchor Peachtree Center, the Merchandise Mart, a wholesale trade and exhibition space which now contains 7.7 million square feet of commercial space. The presence of the Mart, together with the interiors department of Rich's department store, the commercial furniture business Ivan Allen Company, and Peachtree Purchasing, one of the arms of Portman's architecture and development firm, placed the professional services of contract interiors at the heart of the city's economic development. As mayor of Atlanta, Ivan Allen addressed the 38th National Conference of the American Institute of Interior Designers, or AID, held at the Hyatt Regency in 1969. He was addressing an audience whose business he knew well, in a location which had literally and massively expanded the profile and role of interior design. Interiors reported on the conference program and profiled major delegates, quoting the president of the AID, James Merrick Smith, who said, "We must change our profession or we will be bypassed in a world of unprecedented movement and change." The journal praised Smith's decisive leadership of the Institute, noting that his primary achievement since becoming president in 1966 had been to inspire AID members to, quote, participate in urban renewal as members of the environmental team. And a later editorial on Atlanta would quote Portman on Peachtree Center, where he wrote, "This private urban renewal project of mine." While there is clearly more to be investigated regarding the sociopolitics of urban development at this time, and particularly in Atlanta, in what follows I will focus on a spatial reading of Portman's major projects of the period. The attempt will be to deal systematically with Portman's work in order to give concepts to a formation that I'm calling interior urbanism. And just to note that I will also be reading the projects also through the way they were presented in this particular professional magazine, and I'm making a claim for reading the work via a kind of formation of the self-identity of the profession of interior design. So we'll begin here, the house called Entelechy, Atlanta, 1964. The interest of Olga Gueft, the editor of the Interiors magazine, had begun here when she reviewed this house that Portman had built in the suburbs of Atlanta. She commented on the somewhat forbidding, to say the least, impression that the house gave, with its interior hidden under an imposing roof and behind massive columns, the whole design suggesting either fortress or temple. Gaining entry, she experienced the house unfolding as a continuous interior space. Rather than a link between inside and outside, giving the impression of a landscape, the house suggested something more like a city in miniature. And we see some images of it here. And the title of the review was 24 Hollow Columns and the Space Between Them, and you'll see what we mean by that in a moment. So here at Entelechy, 24 hollow exploded columns distributed across a 5x3 grid of squares rises through 2 levels of the house. We have an entry sequence at the second level, and then we move down into double height living spaces at the front here. This is a lake of water that runs the width of the house, dining room sitting on a little island, and then various rooms on both levels of the house. So architecturally, there's an echo, I think, of Louis Kahn, the exploded columns creating something like a poché space in the plan. Their positioning anchors the major rooms of the house, the basic unit of which is a square marked by columns at each corner. The columns organise the vertical circulation across the 2 levels, provide points of transitions between rooms, and contain minor functions such as display spaces, storage, and study nooks. And the structural perimeter of each column, that I think we can see in the drawing, is divided into 8 panelled segments. And the amount of segments actually used in each column defines their permeability, and this varies across the plan. Columns with only 4 structural segments are permeable in 4 directions, such as the column here. And columns, for example, with 6 or 7 panels in this case, are permeable only in 1. Now, I think the relationship between room and column creates certain inside-outside effects across the plan. At one level, walking from a room into a column is akin to walking from inside to outside. Being skylit, the columns bring natural light into the depth of the plan, and their terracotta tile flooring matches the brick surfaces which bound the house in the semicircular courtyard spaces. Now, at another level, because of their scale and separateness from each other, the inside of the columns can also be read as interiors distributed across an urban field defined by the rooms. Now, these 2 possible readings of inside-outside effects suggest a rhythm of spatial alternation operating within the house, room and column switching between inside and outside designations. The house thus has a game board quality to it. The geometry inscribes certain rules of movement, but in combination, these rules produce spatial and experiential complexity. In this way, an urban condition is created within the house without reference to a larger exterior condition. Now, I think this project can be seen as the progenitor of the organisation of Portman's major projects which followed in the next decade. The Hyatt Regency Atlanta and Midnight Sun restaurant in Peachtree Center, the Hyatt Regency San Francisco and Embarcadero Center, and the Los Angeles Bonaventure Hotel and Renaissance Center in Detroit. All of these projects were designed and constructed within a relatively short space of time, in fact, basically at the same time, suggesting that there was a larger project unfolding across projects. And that is regardless, in a sense, of their specific developmental conditions. We shall see in these projects that urban effects, often exuberant, were produced as an integral part of a tightly defined and systematic geometrical arrangement unfolding across all projects. The combination of system and effect emerging from within the conditions governing the series of projects defines what I'm calling interior urbanism, a distinct practice and set of material outcomes operating spatially and economically at the level of urban development. So let's take these ideas forward to analysis of the Hyatt Regency Atlanta. And it was a project featured on the cover here of Interiors. And we see some of the shots inside of the kind of spectacular 22-story atrium. Once again, we've got some sort of analytical drawings. So organisationally, slabs of rooms are arranged around the atrium, which is almost square in plan. Large-scale convention spaces then sit in a partly sunken podium underneath the atrium. Geometrically, even though they form a square block, the slabs of rooms are organised in what is effectively a pinwheel formation, producing a sense of rotational motion and reinforcing the enclosure that the atrium provides. these are these kind of sculptural objects which then take their place on the kind of atrium floor. Now, in its original design, one would enter the atrium from the motor lobby, which was here, through a low-ceilinged tunnel-like entrance. The entrance experience was of spatial compression before release into the atrium space. From the street, one perceives a conventional solid building. One then enters a building entirely voided. In this transition, there is a strange feeling that one hasn't really gone inside at all. Rather, as with Portman's house, Entelechy, the effect is of entering a different kind of outside, an urban condition in its own right. Now, rather than simply being the inside space that the facade protects, the atrium is formed through a kind of folding in of the facade. Given the external and internal facades are materially the same and compositionally consistent, it is as if a building envelope of double height has been folded down into the atrium void. So we would emphasise a kind of continuous facade folded down in that kind of fashion. So this pulling through of the facade is also a pulling through of the urban in the sense that the building no longer simply appears to the city as an exterior form. Rather, it appears to itself on the inside, for which the outside is no longer the primary urban condition. The 22-storey height of the atrium means that it is able to emphasise verticality as an urban quality more convincingly than the building's form perceived externally. One would crane one's neck up as one would in a real metropolis. The vertical kinetic movement and dynamism a metropolis would support is given really an abstract treatment by the elevators which move up and down the exposed elevator shaft. And even a small amount of people occupying the atrium produce an urban din due to the echo of the atrium's hard, reflective surfaces. We see there some of the images of these kind of objects, the elevator shafts, which provide a sense of kinetic movement as you look up or down in a kind of vertiginous relationship. So if we go back to these kind of objects that populate the atrium, they define localised spatial pockets and mediate the atrium's scale. A circular lattice canopy hangs from the top of the atrium by a single metal cord and provides semi-enclosure for an intimate cocktail bar. A terrace cafe offers the experience of a sidewalk, emphasising the outdoor effect of the space, and a monumental conical sculpture rises up through the atrium. One would move through a set of functions and experiences as one might a city, from home to garden to urban plaza, cafe and bar. The splicing together of these experiences was both physical and temporal. Daytime and nighttime activities were spatially juxtaposed. Temporal experience could be abruptly shifted in moving between garden and bar. Looking at a project completed just the year later in a block adjacent to the hotel was the Midnight Sun restaurant, which I think more clearly reads as a variation of Portman's house, which we saw earlier. The dining room surrounds an exterior sunken courtyard, and around its inside edge, circular mushroom-like canopies extend from column heads through the glass line dividing interior and exterior. We can see that more clearly in the drawing, where this is a sunken courtyard, and these column heads are situated around that courtyard, but we see across and through the plan as if there's a kind of no distinction between the kind of inside and outside space. And those columns have the effect of unifying the whole space as a field, extending from inside to outside, unified at ceiling level through those column heads. Adjacent to the dining room and running its full width was a circular bar crowned by another spreading column head, from which radiated circular and elliptical seating clusters. Materials again once participate in the sense of this alternation between inside and outside, with brick flooring organised in a radiating pattern from the centre of the bar out to the edge of the orthogonal space of the bar there. So though this is abstracted in a drawing, we've got kind of materials of brick meeting carpet and this kind of exterior sensibility here, then also meeting an interior one, and all the while flipping between what we might understand to be interior and exterior. And despite its axial organisation, The bar and seating area was slightly rotated around the central axis, suggesting a formal autonomy from the larger axial coordinates and spatial configuration. Now, this sense of a kind of formal autonomy gives rise to another condition of interior urbanism operating at Peachtree Center, the network of concourses and sky bridges linking individual buildings together. Now, this is a photograph of Atlanta in about 1970. So the sunken restaurant sits in here, in a kind of podium flanked by these office towers. The Hyatt we saw earlier is just out of shot on a block here. And we're now looking at these kind of contingent links, these above-grade pedestrian walkways, which stitch together the idea of Peachtree Center and kind of plug in to the whole structure, which was still in formation very much at this time. These connections were above all local. They did not accord with an overall axial or ordered geometrical schema, yet their effect was to join the centre together as a network. Each component of the centre relied on this sense of connection. Yet to produce their interior urban effect, each component also relied on a clear separation from connection. The slight rotation of the Midnight Sun bar, the tunnel-like entranceway separating the Hyatt Atrium from the exterior. The contingent nature of the connections between the different parts of the centre emphasises each as a kind of spatial set piece. And here is a drawing of now the around 16 blocks of what we call Peachtree Center, with the Hyatt Regency Atrium here in the 22-story void. And though it's only very diagrammatic, the Midnight Sun restaurant was in here. And we see the way in which these contingent connections, the green representing an exterior or above street connection, linking all of these blocks together, which Portman assembled as separate parcels of land and with separate developmental deals. So Peachtree Center has been under almost continual development since 1961. And other significant projects include the Peachtree Plaza Hotel, which is now the Westin, which is over here, of 1976. The Marriott Marquis, this 47-story atrium here of 1985. We'll move now to Embarcadero Center, San Francisco. And in many ways, this center was the next step in the development of spatial moves seen at Peachtree Center. Or rather, it was developed in parallel to the phases of Peachtree Center just discussed, but presents a slightly different case because of the integrated design of all of its parts. And here we have the drawing of the exterior kind of arrangement with 4 slab-like office towers, and the hotel we're going to look at in detail, the Hyatt Regency San Francisco, situated here, and all of these towers are joined by above-grade podium connections. So by the time this project was under construction, Portman was very well known for the Hyatt Atlanta, and Interiors devoted a pull-out cover to the Hyatt Regency San Francisco, choosing a shot which emphasised a scaled interior space within the vast expanse of the atrium. Now this time the atrium took on a kind of ziggurat shape, angular in plan due to the constraints of its site, with terraces dramatically stepping in to enclose a wedge of interior space 17 stories at its height. The directness of the folded-in facade at Atlanta was here replicated with a more sculptural condition, a bolder experimentation with spatial form. The irregular shape of the atrium floor, a combination of triangular and oblong areas, posed a particular urban challenge to the design of the spatial elements within. Escalators lead from a motor lobby here up to the atrium, and in its original configuration, a tunnel-like entrance once again mediated the entrance from exterior to interior through here. A sculpture mediated the scale of the atrium and provided a pivot point between the triangular segment and its rectangular segment. And 2 concrete trellis structures anchored each of these segments, with a circular conversation pit anchoring part of the atrium floor as well. And this provided a kind of centripetal as well as centrifugal force, and here we have the kind of classic, 70s conversation pit, both centripetal but also centrifugal around its edge. So I think here at San Francisco, geometrically bold forms anchored the difficult shape of the atrium, While different experiences were spliced together in the Hyatt Regency Atlanta, San Francisco consisted of a more moulded concrete landscape as a fixed and consistent terrain. So the hotel anchors the southeastern edge of the centre, with 4 office towers sitting adjacent to commercial and retail podiums arranged over 4 blocks. And these are all connected by above-grade plaza-like walkways. And these are not at all like the contingent connecting tubes joining parts of Peachtree Center together, and they define a consistent outdoor pedestrian datum which links the entirety of the centre together. Glazed paving tiles in circular arrays move seamlessly from inside the atrium to these outside walkways and plazas, and down to the surrounding street-level sidewalks around the centre. The difference between interior and exterior is lowered in this material continuity, and the entire development takes on the appearance of a sculpted environment experienced inside the atrium. More clearly than in Peachtree Center, where its constituent parts were contingently linked, there is a larger interiority defining the whole Embarcadero complex, whether one is inside the atrium or outside in its pedestrian environment. Now we move, almost at the same time, to Los Angeles. As if literalizing the geometry of that first house, Entelechy, here at the Bonaventure, circular forms became the structural basis and arrangement of the hotel, with 5 circular towers rising from an orthogonal podium with sky bridges connecting to adjacent buildings. If we look at this basic arrangement, we also understand that the circular form provides the most efficient form for getting the required amount of hotel rooms on the site. It solves any condition of there being front or back or difference of view, and also solves condition of overlooking between the rooms. So yes, as I said, there's no conventional front or back to the complex, and the services for each of the towers must then drop through the middle of the atrium. So here we've got a kind of drawing of the complexity of the way that servicing drops through the middle. This produces an effect when walking around the atrium on these terraces here of directed but circular movement. One is always walking towards and then around one of the 5 impenetrable service cores. And what would normally be experienced as part of the core, the elevators are again spectacularly present, moving silently through the atrium and then externally up 4 shafts which link all of the towers together. So the elevators actually move up the exterior of the building, and one then uses the corridor spaces to cross into the internal spaces of the towers. So the effect of this geometrically clear arrangement has to be sorted out in the atrium. While their atriums differ in basic geometry, the challenge of the Bonaventure and the Hyatt Regencies in Atlanta and San Francisco was the same: to define smaller pockets of inhabitable space, smaller scale inside spaces within the larger scale interior of the atrium. At the Bonaventure, elliptical pods cling to circulation paths around the central core. And the distribution of these pods in 3 dimensions presents the atrium as a kind of occupiable volume, rather than as differentiated ground plane. And these pods also echo the wedge-shaped hotel rooms in the towers, creating autonomous zones as in Peachtree Center. Taken as a kind of integrated structure, the atrium walkways underscore the autonomy of the atrium interior as a whole, with connections to the exterior once again being local and contingent. I guess one thing I haven't commented on and do in a different part of my work is, of course, Frederick Jameson's famous epiphany of postmodern hyperspace whilst wandering around getting lost in the Bonaventure Hotel. Now we move to, and once again, exactly at the same time, Renaissance Center, which took the arrangement and material conditions of the Bonaventure Hotel and enlarged them by about 100%, with a concomitant jump in spatial effect. As in Los Angeles, 5 symmetrically arranged towers meet an orthogonal podium, out of which the atrium space is carved. 4 perimeter towers are chamfered orthogonal forms and were derived from Portman's Fort Worth National Bank building. Apparently what actually happened is that the model makers in the office who were making a model for one of these towers in Fort Worth were told to make 4 more of them and transfer them to the Detroit project. So there's this absolute kind of circulation of material between all of these projects, and it's no wonder, in a sense, because all of these projects were on the drawing board at exactly the same time. Now, due to the different shapes of the tower's footprints, the ensuing geometry of the atrium combines circle and diamond. The total enclosure ensured by the circularity at the Bonaventure is here transformed into a component of a much larger network. The orthogonal interior walkways surrounding the central core offer connections to other potential phases of the development. Now, having been built on a cleared site, Renaissance Centre was not constrained by an existing street grid, and unlike the Bonaventure Hotel, it could define the potential for adjacent connection from within its own interior arrangement. Theoretically, at least, this network could extend to and become the entirety of the city. The coherent interior urbanism operating across, let's say, Embarcadero Center exists literally inside Renaissance Centre's vast atrium. This only serves to emphasize the idea that interior urbanism need not be about literal enclosure, but is rather about the coherence of an arrangement where insides and outsides, connectors and autonomous spaces and forms are put into a dynamic play. Now, the analysis of these projects has emphasized the consistency of geometrical organization and, to a large extent, the consistency of a material palette which underpins the effects of this organization. Portman's house, Entelechy, is the site of this arrangement, the play between column and room, displaying how an urban condition, that is, the ability to move from inside to outside across an ordered arrangement of forms, was created in the interior of the house without reference to an exterior. Renaissance Centre here comes closest to this original condition, in large part because it was constructed on a cleared site, without constraints as to how its geometry would play out. It implies a potential for infinite connection and urbanism sui generis. And we might say that particular kinds of solutions proliferated through Portman's work. And if we were to look at the pages of interiors, we see stark evidence of the atrium's proliferation through the work of many other firms at this time. Now, Portman made the cover of interiors with each of his successive projects, but this literal expansion of the interior was visible not just through the type of work that the magazine published, but in the means that it employed to do so. In the middle of the 1960s, editor Olga Gueft had conceived of the interior in terms of environmental design as a spatial expansion of the designer's remit, and in terms of contract interiors as the core of the interiors business. Having championed Portman's work, the amount of atrium buildings that the journal would publish increased markedly by the mid-1970s. Now, these are some of Portman's projects published. This is the Fort Worth Tower that became multiplied by 4 in Detroit. And then we see this proliferation, the moving through of the atrium through the work of almost every single major firm from the middle of the 1970s onwards, with these projects, which I'll run through just very quickly. The Hyatt Regency Houston by a group called Joint Venture 3. The Crown Center in Kansas City by Harry Weiss and Associates, where the interior contained a tropical garden built around an existing rock escarpment. And I do enjoy these kind of slightly bewildered people trying to work out where they are and what to do. And the meeting of kind of water, stone, and carpet within the space of a couple of meters. This is the USAA Home Office in San Antonio by Niehaus and Taylor. Probably more well known, the Pacific Design Center in LA by Cesar Pelli. The mixed-use Galleria building in New York City by David Kenneth Spector. The Riverfront Towers in St. Louis by William Tabler and Associates. The Hyatt Regency Dallas by Welton Beckett. The Hyatt Regency Cambridge by Graham Gund. The Chicago Holiday Inn Mart Plaza by SOM. And that really is just a limited selection. And I'm reading out these names because these are firms, the names of which you will never have heard. Okay, but they are producing this kind of large-scale interior work right off the bat, really, of Portman's work. But the atrium becomes, in some ways his signature, but also something more like a proliferating force that just moves through architectural production at that time. And literally to map that, all I did was sit in the RIBA library for a period, flipping page by page and just photographing these spreads. So, urban scale interiors appeared in institutional and commercial buildings, in schools and university campuses, but their appearance had as much to do with editorial policy as it did with spatial and economic transformation in architecture and interior design. By the middle of the 1970s, editor Olga Gueft had become editorial director, with C. Ray Smith and then Stanley Abercrombie taking on the role of editor. At this time, the journal officially changed its name to Contract Interiors, elevating what had been a section of the magazine to masthead status, and dividing residential projects first into a series of quarterly supplements and then into a separate magazine. So with the domestic context no longer visible in the main publication, Interiors became about contract interiors operating as a business at an urban scale. In an editorial, Abercrombie was clear about the professional rationale for this, suggesting it reflected changes in the profession itself and noting only a small overlap between the readers of the domestic and the contract issues of the publication. This period was also marked by a more expansive photographic sensibility, of we've seen ample examples of, matched to the increased scale and spaces of the spaces on show, with a significant increase in the use of saturated colour and a near universal use of photography on the front cover, where illustrations had been the norm in the 1960s. Reading through Interiors through the 1970s, it seemed that cities really were being made from linked furniture components organised into spatial arrays within extensive architectural structures, where you weren't sure if you were really inside or outside. And as such, we might connect these projects to today's renaissance of the street and understand that in all its planter box, safe sidewalk, shared surface, exterior glory, it has learned its lesson, for better or worse, from the worlds that Portman first created inside. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.